Hi and welcome to another episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I'm Z, aka the Reluctant Accountant. Let's get into it. Okay, so today I'm doing the second part of my Grenfell episodes. This is a part 2, and I really wanted to do it over 2 episodes, specifically because I don't want to rush it and I want to kind of gather my thoughts when I'm talking and make sure that I've articulated and clearly explained why I'm talking about this subject matter and why I think it's so important to keep this discussion and keep talking about this. Now, in last week's episode, I spoke about Grenfell as in the incident, what happened, and the kind of immediate fallout, what came after it, and what that means, for us as a society, what that means for us as citizens of a country that's supposed to be modern, that's supposed to be developed and progressive, and how that incident and how the tragedy of Grenfell was a damning indictment of how we treat what is effectively the underclass in this country. And so this episode, I'm going to focus on the report. So if you're unaware, on the 14th of June, 2017, Grenfell Tower, which is a 24-storey apartment block within the UK, within North Kensington, the borough of Kensington in Chelsea, caught fire at 1 a.m. in the morning due to a refrigerator catching fire, and the fire quickly spread throughout the building and 72 lives were lost. And why I wanted to speak about this, because that was 7 years ago. We finally had the second phase of the inquiry and a report be published. The first phase of the inquiry looked at what happened on the night and, established that the primary cause of the fire spreading so rapidly was the cladding that was on the external cladding that was on the building. And the second phase of the report, which I'm going to kind of talk to you about now, talked about how the cladding got on the building in the first place. And if you're thinking, well, how did it? It's a very good question, because we are supposed to have regulation in this country. We are supposed to have regulation and testing that ensures that our homes are safe. And growing up in this country, you will hear a lot, an Englishman's home is his castle. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some keyboard warriors telling me that some of those people weren't English. If our society is saying that in England, your home is supposed to be your castle, the fortress in which you are safe, then by any metric, and certainly by the metric of this old adage, we've definitely failed these people. So I wanted to look at the second phase of the report and really talk about the different factions, companies and factions of society that are called out, and just so that you can know how this was like a cacophony of cups and neglect and just outright disregard for the safety of people that live in our communities. So one of the departments that are called out is the Department for Communities and Local Government. And it's very interesting because things need to be signed off whenever, buildings, and you'll know if you've ever dealt with like a new build, that there needs to be a sign off that the materials are safe, that the building is safe, and so on and so forth. What's interesting that this sign off, and I work in a regulated industry, and so I understand about regulation, and there's always this push between the businesses and the regulator, especially if the regulator's doing their job. There should be a little bit of friction. There shouldn't be, we're getting along. It's not the get along gang. And certainly we know from the financial crash of 2008, that getting along too much with a regulator is not a good thing. We also know from the crash in 2008 that there was a severe lack of regulation that led to that. If people and products were being regulated more robustly, we probably wouldn't have had this situation in 2008. So it always amazes me when proponents of no regulation come forward and they're like, we don't need the government interfering and we don't need this. And whilst there's an argument to say, yes, there should be limits on how much the government can interfere and the state can interfere in your personal life, I think there is a public life that we have, and there's certain things to do with safety that are not just about your personal safety, certainly the quality of materials and whether people are allowed to lie and deceive and just put profit over my safety, over the safety of public, is a public issue. That isn't a personal issue. So advocating for lack of regulation in places where it's sorely needed is just irresponsible and actually quite stupid. And so you hear this quite a lot. And certainly there are governments that come in with agendas to light touch regulation. And I say governments because the conditions for the crash came under a Labour government and are quite similar to conditions we could have expected under a Tory government. Indeed, the Tories make no bones about the fact that they're in favour of pulling back on regulation and letting the market sort itself out. Of course, until the market crashes and doesn't sort itself out, then it's us that need to go in and help it. But that's another issue for another day. So the Department for Communities and Local Government were very excited about this era of light touch regulation, and so a lot of things were just ignored, they were delayed, or they just signed off on stuff. And that is explicitly stated within the report, by the way. And this goes also when we're talking about the testing and marketing of products. One thing that was significantly called out in the report, and one of the reasons why Grenfell Tower became clad in combustible materials, was the systematic dishonesty on the part of those who sold the rain screen cladding and the insulation products. The report said that they engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and essentially to mislead the market. And it says that in the case of the principal insulation product that was used on the Grenfell Tower, which was Celotex RS5000, the building research establishment, the BRE, was complicit in that strategy. So the BRE was complicit in the strategy to manipulate and falsify test data. So also mentioned, and I'm going to mention the names of the companies that are mentioned in the report, is a company called Arconic. So from 2005 until the Grenfell Tower fire, Arconic deliberately concealed from the market the true extent of the danger of using Bond 55 PE in cassette form, particularly on high-rise buildings. By the summer of 2011, it was well aware that Bond 55 PE in cassette form performed much worse in a fire and was considerably more dangerous than in riveted form. And nonetheless, it was determined to exploit what it saw as weak regulatory environments in certain countries, specifically in the UK, so they sold it in cassette form to use on residential buildings. This is despite the knowledge that they gained from fires in Dubai in 2012 and 2013 about how the cladding responds. They didn't consider withdrawing it. Even then, they chose to continue rather than opt for a more fire-resistant version, which was available. By the way, on their website, Celotex says that they are a leading provider of high-performance insulation solutions, specialising in developing and delivering innovative and intelligent insulation products tailored to meet the needs of our customers, their clients, and the evolving demands of modern construction projects. Okay. So they embarked on a dishonest scheme to mislead the customers and the wider market. So what happened? They had the complicity of the BRE. So in May 2014, Celotex tested in accordance with BS 8414 system, incorporating the RS5000. So the RS5000, they had that contain 2 sets of fire-resistant magnesium oxide boards. They placed them in critical positions to ensure that it passed the test. They then obtained from BRE a test report that omitted any reference to the magnesium oxide boards. So what they did is they put through the test, they put these magnesium oxide boards, which were fire resistant, so that they can make sure it passed the test. And when then they got the report from BRE, they didn't put in that the magnesium oxide boards were there. So then they marketed this RS5000 as the first PIR board to successfully test to BS 8414 standards. And then said, obviously, that is acceptable to use in buildings above 18 metres high, which was not true. No mention that it needed to have those magnesium oxide boards there. So then there's Kingspan. Kingspan knew that K15 could not honestly be sold as suitable for use in external walls of buildings over 18 metres high. But that's what they did for many years anyway. So in their marketing of K15, Kingspan used the results of a single BS8414 test performed in 2005. So a test performed in 2005 on a system whose components were not representative of a typical wall, and it relied on those tests without disclosing that it had changed the composition of the product in 2006. They test in 2005 with something that doesn't represent a wall anyway, and then they change the composite of the product in 2006, and they just carry on saying, look, well, we had this test in 2005, that should apply to everything that comes after it. So they did have tests in 2007 and 2008, which incorporated the current form of K15. They were disastrous. And so what did Kingspan do? Nothing. They didn't withdraw the product. Despite their own concerns about the safety and the performance, whatever, they did nothing about it. So then there's Siderise. Siderise manufactured the Lamatherm barriers used in the refurbishment. So there was no evidence for them of dishonesty that was detailed within the report, but some aspects of their marketing materials were deemed to give cause for concern. And it also supplied cavity barriers for use in voids larger than for those for which it had been tested for. Then you've got the BBA. So the dishonest strategies of Arconic and Kingspan succeeded in large measure due to the incompetence of BBA. The report found that the BBA was largely incompetent and failed to adhere robustly to the system of checks it had put in place, and that BBA had an ingrained willingness to accommodate its customers instead of insisting on high standards. Oh, BBA stands for the British Board of Agreement, by the way. I said agrément. I'm not trying to be funny. It's spelled agré, like A-G-R-E with an accent, and then M-E-N-T. So it was also said in the report that the local authority building control needs to take their share of the blame for what happened, because LABC accepted into the market Celotex and their RS5000 and the Kingspan K15 for use on buildings that were over 18 metres high. And it says that there was a complete failure by LABC over the years to take basic steps to ensure that the certificates that it was issuing were technically accurate. Then there's the NHBC, and I'm going to take a sigh when I talk about these because I have personal experience of the National House Building Control. So they failed to ensure that the building control function remained essentially regulatory and free of commercial pressures. It's unwilling to upset its own customers, which is true if you've ever tried to deal with the NHBC to get them to do something. They don't deem you as their customer, they deem the people that build as their customers, and they're very reluctant to go against them and get anything done. It was unwilling to reveal the scale of the use of combustible insulation in external walls of high-rise buildings, contrary to the statutory guidance. The report concluded that the conflict between the regulatory function of building control and the pressures of commercial interests prevents a system of that kind from effectively serving the public interests. Look, everyone's getting it in this report. It's very detailed and it goes through all of these people. In fact, I'm not going to even touch on every single thing because I won't have time, but I wanted to highlight how pervasive these failings were. And it wasn't just a case of a mistake or an error. These were actively acts of dishonesty that took place. So UKAS, the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, did not always follow its own policies, and its assessment processes were lacking in rigour and comprehensiveness. Even when failures were identified, they were not properly explored and opportunities to improve them not always taken. And now I come to the tenant management organisation, and I have a lot of vim for these people because I don't really have time for people that don't want to interact with people from certain classes or inherently treat those people with a lot of disdain. And that is something that is explicitly called out in the report. It says that the relationship between the residents and the TMO had been troubled for many, many years. That was even before the refurbishments at the Grenfell Tower. So they had two independent reports in 2009 had drawn attention to the numerous serious flaws in that relationship. The second of those reports, by the way, identified governance, customer service, staff attitudes, and a poor repairs service as constant themes of the investigation. And it also said that the residents' lack of trust of the TMO lay at the heart of the problems. It's interesting that it's even phrased it that way. That report, this isn't the inquiry report, this was the report in 2009. It had 34 recommendations for change. What's interesting is saying that the lack of trust lay at the heart of the problems, when actually what comes first? Because people aren't always inherently, in fact, we couldn't function as a society if we were inherently just didn't trust people. There has to be a certain amount of trust. Or could it be that the governance issues, the lack of customer service, the poor maintenance was the reason that there was a lack of trust? Did that not come first? Anyway, so what this report, the inquiry report, concluded from all the evidence from 2011 to 2017, the relations between the TMO and many of the residents of Grenfell Tower were increasingly characterized by distrust, dislike, personal antagonism, and anger. Some, perhaps many of the residents of the Grenfell Tower, regarded the TMO as uncaring and bullying, and they said that they felt belittled and marginalized by them. Residents complained that they were regarded as a nuisance, and worse, that they failed to take their concerns seriously. And for its part, it says that the TMO regarded that some of the residents as militant troublemakers, led by just a handful of vocal activists. Principally, they called out someone called Edward Darfan, whose style they said they found offensive. And the result was a toxic atmosphere fueled by mistrust on both sides. What's interesting is that, for me, I can understand having to deal with people that you maybe found difficult, but that is your job. And your job is also to be the one that's professional. And it doesn't mean that you therefore ignore the safety concerns or the concerns of a whole entire group of people because you may be warranted or unwarranted have some weird personal beef with an individual. So I don't have as much time as I want to, but I do want to just kind of go over and say, the report also mentions that the Royal Borough of Kensington Chelsea was responsible for overseeing the TMO's activities, not monitoring its operations on a day-to-day basis, but its oversight of the TMO's performance was weak, and the fire safety was not subject to any key performance indicators. So first, for example, although in 2009 an independent fire safety consultant had recommended that a fire safety strategy be prepared, nothing was done until November 2013. And by the time of the fire in 2017, a final strategy had still not been approved. There were a selection of other problems. TMO's only fire assessor for the entire estate was Carl Stokes, and he was allowed to drift into that role without any formal selection or procurement process. By the way, he had misrepresented his experience and qualifications, some of which he had just invented. And he was, by all accounts, ill qualified to carry out the fire task and the fire assessments on a building of that size and complexity as Grenfell Tower, let alone hold the whole TMO portfolio. And I want to get onto this bit quickly because I don't want to run out of time. So Kensington Aldridge Academy and Leisure Centre, Calc, I'll call them, projects, they explained how Calc Project influenced the appointment of Studio E as the architect and described the way in which the TMO manipulated the procurement process to avoid having to put the contract for architectural services out to public tender. And if you know anything about things going out to tender, you know that happens quite a lot. Artelio was appointed by the TMO as a consultant, having acted as employer's agent and quantity surveyor for Calc Project. Although Studio E had wanted to use zinc rainskin panels, cost became increasingly important consideration for the TMO, and eventually an aluminium composite material, the ACM, Rainer Bond 55 PE was chosen, largely on the grounds of cost, not because it was anything safe. Rydon was able to offer a substantial saving through the use of the ACM panels as a result of his relationship with his intended cladding subcontractor, Harley. None of those that were involved in the design of the external wall or the choice of material acted in accordance with the standards of a reasonably competent person in their position. This is what the report found. They were not familiar with or did not understand the relevant provisions of the building regulations, approved document B, or industry guidance. And it says in this report, the risks of using combustible materials in external walls of high-rise buildings were well known and they should have been aware of them. And I just want to say before I close off, because there were others that were mentioned in the report. They do mention the fire service. They do mention a lack of training. They do mention that there were problems with the fire service's response, not least because years before we had in South London, Larkanor House had also caught fire. And even just on a case of how to deal with multiple calls about the same thing, there was a lack of training and experience. And I guess as well, this was exacerbated by the fact that many of the firefighters that arrived on the scene had no experience of being at buildings where they believed that fire safety procedures had been in place. So they had no experience of being in responding to fires in which buildings were essentially like tinderboxes. And so I think this report bears a read. There is an executive summary that you can read because it's, over 1,000 pages long, the entire report. But I think it definitely deserves to be read because I think the lives of those 72 people deserve to be remembered. They're not just a number, 72. They were people, they were lives, they had dreams, they had hopes. And that what makes, for me, it's so damning and egregious to see when that report was being read out in Parliament, the number of MPs that just got up and left their seats and didn't seem to give a damn. Because this is one of the worst national disasters that we've had in this country, and they just didn't care. So if anything, hopefully this will be a wake-up call for many people to really consider their own position and whether they've just forgotten about it and they're just on to the next thing. Because these failures, this extreme agenda to put profits over people, to manipulate, to lie, to have light regulation or no regulation, to have collusion. I want you to also remember that because of the state of the courts and the police have now said that it's unlikely that any charges will be brought for another 18 months. So yet the victims and the survivors and everyone needs to continue waiting because we know that actually these people aren't going to do, we're relying on good people to do good things and there aren't good people doing those good things. We then rely on regulators to enforce it and we're coming off the back of a culture of light regulation and light touch and the business will just do what they want. And we're doing this under the shadow of Grenfell when we know what the culmination of these policies are and what all of these roads lead to. And I think we definitely need to do better. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for joining me for this second part of this episode. I'll try to put a link in. So if you want to download the report, you can. If you want to get in touch with me, you can get me at the misinformationpodcast@gmail.com. That's the misinformationpodcast@gmail.com. I'm also on TikTok and Instagram at the reluctant accountant. But until next week, I'll see you then.